To this December 15th session of the WHO COVID-19 Costing, Financing, Budgeting, and Delivery learning session. Today's session is going to focus on a global status update, a year in reflection, and a year ahead. My name is Bruce Struminger. I'm with Project ECHO. It's our pleasure supporting this learning series. I'm going to run through a few logistic items. Next slide. First, we have interpretation available in French and Spanish. You can access those by clicking on the interpretation button, the globe icon at the bottom right of the Zoom toolbar. Choose the language you'd like to hear. If you would like to mute the original language, click Mute Original Audio. Next slide. We really look forward to your questions and comments today. Please put those in the Q&A feature, which is just to the left of the interpretation button. And we'll be monitoring those and hope to get to as many of them as we're able to. If you have any questions about IT issues or logistics or about the certificate of attendance, put those in the chat and we'll try to answer those also as best we can. Next slide. There will be a live transcript, subtitles of the English, which you can access by clicking on the live transcript icon. And that's in between the Q&A icon and the interpretation icon. And that will show you a running subtitle. Next slide. We are recording today's session, and your attendance is consent to be recorded. Thank you for that. The recordings in English, French, and Spanish will all be made available and shared after the session. And we'll put in the chat links to several places you can find them. The TechNet 21 site, and there's a website that supports this learning series. We are offering a certificate of attendance. It's through the University of New Mexico, where Project ECHO is based. We'll be sharing a link in the chat about 15 minutes before the end of the session. That will lead you to a brief survey that'll take about 3 minutes to complete. This is the last session in this series, and we really look forward to your feedback and look forward to your thoughts on ideas for the future. Next slide. Just a quick note about data use. We take data stewardship very seriously. All your data that you share when you register through the Q&A in the chat is all very carefully stewarded. And what is shared is all de-identified, but what we share with WHO. With that, if we can bring the slides down, I'm going to pass it over to Angela Shen and Ann Lindstrom with WHO for the formal welcome.
Great, thanks so much, Bruce. I'm joined here with Ann Lindstrom from WHO headquarters as well. We are going to kind of warm up a bit to start off with a poll question. We're going to do a word cloud, and there should be a link in the chat box for you to connect to the word cloud. And so please click the link. And the first question is, what country are you joining from? So click the word cloud, type in the country, brilliant, and into the link. And as folks put in their country, it should populate. If your country has 2 words in it, for example, South Africa, write an underscore in between South and Africa. So type in South _ Africa, and it'll come up as one entity, South Africa. Great, it looks like folks are, the cloud is coming to shape. Brilliant. Anne, some thoughts?
No, I hope that everyone puts their geography in really quickly, and I hope you, because you see that the world map here is expanding, and many people have joined us from all parts and all regions, so you can also introduce yourself in the chat, put your name and organization. But here we would like to just warm you up with looking at all around the world where you're coming from today, and we're welcome.
Great. The link is right above you, Iman. It says poly. Great. Okay. So let's try another question. The second question is we'll have another poll link. And the second question is, what 3 words would you use to describe your experience with COVID-19 vaccination rollout in 2021? So type in your 3 words into the box. If you want a phrase to come up, if you want some words to come up as a phrase, use the underscore.
So while you're doing that, I just wanted to comment. I mean, everyone around the world who has worked in COVID-19 vaccine delivery has had a fantastic and very challenging year. It's like a dragon who wakes up and have done everything, you know, folded out its wings and been able to be all over and everywhere, and really been using all the capacities that we have on the new know-how of EPI from decades and decades. That's how we've actually managed to do this. So, but we also see inequities. We see the stress, the frustration that we're challenged and exhausted at this time of year, at the end of the year. Rapid, dynamic, evidence-based, and a lot of fear and frustration as well. We've had all emotions, I think, over this year. And the main word here is coming out is challenging. And I do think after the end of this, at the end of 2021, an absolutely extraordinary year in immunization, I do agree with you. I also have been feeling challenged so many times, exhausted so many times, but also a profound pride in what we've all accomplished.
Thanks, Anne. This is really a profound reflection of many mixed emotions and realities. So I'm really happy that, Diana, you suggested we do the word cloud. Why don't we save this and shift to our third and final question for the word cloud? As we take this down, I'll queue up the last question, which is, name 2 remaining challenges you see in scale up of COVID-19 vaccination for the upcoming year 2022. Click the link. And if you want a phrase, then please use the underscore as the phrase. So South Africa would be South_Africa. And let's see what folks are putting up. So it looks like y'all are getting the hang of this. Very clear and expected challenges. Give it about 30 more seconds.
So here we see the big words. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
The big words are supply, equity, inequity, funding, finding the unreached. Oh, there are many challenges coming up here. I think that's also a ticket for, oh, it's becoming smaller and smaller. We can't read it anymore. it's a ticket to the last word as well of where we are. We need to act on all of these things that you have on this word cloud, increasing equity, increasing supply, reaching the unreached. And that's why we're here today as well, of drilling down and looking at the bottlenecks and where are we at the moment and what can we do more in 2022.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. So thank you all for participating in the word cloud to give us some additional insight as to what's going on in the field, in the region, and where you are. So we are going to shift to the next agenda item. Anne Lindstrom, you have a few announcements. You're going to queue up the agenda and the learning objectives for today. Anne, over to you.
Yes, before we leave over to the opening speech by Kate O'Brien, the director of our Department of Immunization, we just want to announce a few things coming in through the COVAX and what's going on at the moment. So we're very glad to see that we now have a joint appointed global lead coordinator on country delivery. It's Ted Scheiben. He's worked as regional director in Middle East and now as North of Africa for UNICEF. But this time he is jointly appointed by Henrietta Fore in UNICEF and Tedros in WHO, and with the support of all the COVAX collaborative organizations, Gavi and CEPI and everyone, in trying to increase the capacity and the coordination that we have at a global level, working with all the 3 levels of our different organizations in making the best possible support to quick rollout and delivery in country. So we're welcoming Ted. He's coming in very soon to be working jointly with WHO and UNICEF and with Gavi on the increased delivery. I just wanted to announce as well that we are in the next year working towards a new allocation mechanism. I think Kate will touch on this, which will be much more country sensitive to reaching and supporting the targets and the preferences that countries would want. And that I'm talking about from the COVAX facility. But we all need to understand and see the full challenges countries are facing with different supplies from not just COVAX, but for other places as well, including AVAT and PAHO and other mechanisms of bilateral deals and procurements. It all boils down to you, the routine immunization and the programs trying to deliver as fast as possible all of these vaccines together. So a stronger coordination and a stronger support in everything that we can do. And so we welcome Ted in the next year. I think that was it for announcements right now.
Great, let's advance the slides. Anne, do you want to run through the agenda, or I'm happy to if you like?
Okay, no, so today's session it's a mix of a few things. I mean, it's really at the end of the year, we're trying to step back and say what happened actually this very intense year. So welcome and thoughts by Kate O'Brien, Director of the Department of Immunization, Vaccines and Biologicals in WHO. And then a year in review, looking at some of the data and some country stories. Then we have an eminent CRD and a panel, country readiness and delivery panel. Finally, we'll have our WHE colleagues also looking at what they are thinking of accelerating in 2022. And closing in remarks by Mike Ryan from the emergency department. So now over, yeah. So the goal and the learning objective, what we're thinking of here is really looking at, as we said, the COVID-19 vaccine rollout in 2021. We need to share and look at the priorities for 2022 and see how we can all work on supporting the COVID-19 vaccination campaigns and taking them to another scale. at the moment. So the learning objectives here today is to reflect upon the emergency response actions from the past year and how the response will be shaped in 2022, and share data on progress in country readiness, response coverage, and other indicators of progress. So now I think it's over to Kate for the opening speech.
Thanks so much, Anne and Angela, all of you for being in this ECHO session. So it's quite extraordinary to realize that we are approaching the beginning of the third year of this pandemic. I'm not sure any of us expected that we would be in that place. And last week on December 8th marked the 1-year anniversary since the first person received a COVID vaccine through the routine rollout of vaccination. In other words, outside of clinical trials. We're now at over 8 billion doses in less than a year that have been deployed. And this is also a time to reflect that although there has been 8 billion doses deployed, the global program, the global equity program, has really been severely constrained by supply. And our focus collectively has been so much this year on working to secure supply, deploy it in an equitable way, and offer as much forecasting visibility as is possible to countries for their planning and program development. So we're now in this real hybrid phase. Over the past 8 weeks or so, since the October supply deployments, October, November, and now December, we're in this hybrid phase where supply is ramping up for AMC countries. And yet the security and the sightline of that supply moving into 2022 still remains fragile, even as 1.4 billion doses of vaccine have been allocated to countries through the COVAX facility. So we need to pivot and shift our collective focus towards delivery and evolve the ways in which we're working so that countries are firmly at the center of how we operate. And we need to put country data at the heart of that demand planning. This demand planning is absolutely critical. The national plans, the targets, the cold chain capacity, the absorption capacity, the political context, the health workforce, all of those things require super intense planning and then deployment. And we've been in this end of year sprint, and already as part of the end of the year sprint, to get as many doses out as possible, targeting at least 800,000 doses delivered through COVAX. We've really increased the engagement with many countries that are AMC countries through the deep dives that have been going on, and really trying to help knock over the dominoes, break through those bottlenecks, the specific challenges that countries are facing in order to ramp up the pace of deployment and to really better understand what country demand is for the early part of next year, what products, what volume, and what timing countries can and want their supply to come in. And then we will be continuing to manage the allocations and the delivery support accordingly, according to that demand. So as we've seen the supply increase in these past really 8 to 10 weeks, we're also seeing very significant increases in absorption capacity. As an example, in the third quarter of this year, the AMC countries administered just about 3 times more doses than in quarter 1 or quarter 2. So when supply starts to surge, countries are absolutely able to scale the program. That's not to say that there aren't a small number of countries that do have chronic and systemic challenges that are affecting whether or not they can absorb. And that includes countries that are fragile states, insecure areas, and states that are in the midst of conflict. And those are real challenges for those countries. Some populations outside the remit of their national governments. So on the issue of operational planning, we have a huge challenge ahead on country operational planning for 2022. It's been difficult because of the unpredictability and uncertainty of the supply, but we very much plan and hope that the manufacturers and the donors can do their part in establishing a clearer sight line, less fragility in that supply for 2022. So that would give as much transparency and predictability for a longer timeline as possible, so countries can plan accordingly. So we'll be working to plan out monthly and product-focused delivery plans for that supply forecasting clarity on the part of countries. It will be driven by demand from countries. And this is the phase 2 of the allocation. If phase 2 of allocation is going to be successfully demand-driven, it means supporting countries to the level of ambition and capacity that countries set, which means countries have to have the best planning, the best communication of their own country vaccination targets that align with whatever their context is and their health priorities are. And it also means that with our vaccine portfolios that are expanding, probably we'll see whether or not there's completion of emergency use listing, but we have the Novavax product and the Clover product, 2 products on a new platform that has not been available to date for COVID vaccines are coming through. And so countries are also going to need to express not only how many doses they want on a monthly basis, but of which product they want or products. And most countries on average are deploying 4 different COVID vaccines. So again, a complex task for countries and really important on their planning and their preferred portfolio. And if that weren't enough, here we are for the past 2 weeks now facing a new variant, Omicron, which has really thrown up to us new challenges and really reminding us that the phrase that we've all been using, that no country is safe until every country is safe, is not a slogan. It's epidemiology, it's virology, that vaccine equity is the issue here. And to prevent ongoing transmission, ongoing waves of disease really means that we have to live out vaccine equity for real in 2022. So we're working with technical partners to understand the potential impact of Omicron on the existing vaccines. It's very early days still. There are preliminary data on the neutralization capacity of post-vaccination sera from humans. And we have 2 early reports now of the clinical performance of the Pfizer vaccine in particular, but also a little bit on the AstraZeneca vaccine against Omicron. I really want to emphasize, so one is from the UK, one report from South Africa last night. And I really want to emphasize that it is too early to draw conclusions, but I think our expectations that the vaccines will continue to perform against Omicron at some level, and especially probably the severe end of the disease spectrum is the end of the disease spectrum that we would expect the performance of the vaccines to be most preserved. But for now, our message is that we are still in a Delta pandemic. The majority of cases, disease, hospitalizations, and deaths around the world are from Delta, notwithstanding that we are dealing with something very different in the form of Omicron, and the rapidity of transmission and doubling curves of Omicron is unlike any other variant that we've seen before. So early days on Omicron, the message continues to be that the vaccines work against the variants, particularly Delta, which is dominant, and we're learning about the performance of the vaccine against Omicron. I also want to emphasize the importance as we go into 2022 of prioritization of populations for vaccination. I think everybody is familiar with the prioritization of healthcare workers, older adults, those with underlying medical conditions to be the primary target of the earliest doses of vaccine. And in some countries, those communities, those populations have not been vaccinated fully yet. As we move forward, we're also learning more about the durability of the performance of the vaccines having been given in primary schedules. And we will continue to update the recommendations on what an optimal vaccine schedule is, especially for those groups that are at highest risk of disease. And so this, of course, references the role of booster doses, and how best to continue to protect those as transmission continues around the world. This is important about not only protecting individuals from serious disease, hospitalization, or death, but also protecting the health system, which even when we have a variant that may be less mild than other variants in terms of severity, nevertheless, when huge numbers of people are being infected, it will by definition be putting enormous pressure on the health system. So I'll stop there. Those are sort of my preview about where we've been in 2021 and some of the things ahead for us in 2022 that are going to require us to pivot, to adapt, and to move into 2022 with new focus, adjusted focus to address the new situation of trying to optimize the use of the vaccines that we have and get to the end of this pandemic. So I'm eager to hear the rest of the session with all of you, and I'll turn it back over to, I think, Angela. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks for carving out time to be here with us today. If folks have questions for Kate or others, please put them in the chat box. We're going to scooch along to the next slide. I'm pleased to introduce Anne Lindstrom, who will be giving a kind of a year in review. Anne, over to you.
Thank you so much. And so I am speaking on behalf of a very big team. First of all, many reflections from us in COVAX and the country readiness and delivery with WHO, UNICEF, and Gavi. Also from where I work as unit head of EPI in WHO in Geneva, immense pride to see that my team in EPI, all of COVAX, but foremost, in the front and foremost, really the step up of every immunization person in the world of this year that has just passed, this extraordinary year. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to go through a few things, how we got to where we are today, some country spotlights, and I'll get help from Vinod Burrows on the line, and what we'll need to do next year. So next slide, in the next 15 minutes. And this is the graph that really is quite extraordinary about what all immunization people, and particularly countries, have been able to manage in just one single year. This is the fastest and the most complex vaccine introduction globally ever in history. So all countries, more or less, have already introduced, and this was within a time frame of 8-9 months, more or less. I know that's taken very much of everyone's effort. We saw that in the word cloud as well. But I also see immense pride here, seeing how routine immunizations, the know-how from decades and decades of understanding how immunization works, has been put to a test. And I think that you all immunization around the world, have actually stepped out and up and delivered. Next slide. So if you look at the COVAX facility, the first time, the extraordinary piece in 2021 as well is the short time frame between a high-income country rolling out new vaccines and actually seeing them also being rolled out in low-income country. That usually takes years. Here, it was something like 40 days. The 24th of February, it was the first batch of COVAX doses that came to Ghana. And there were others in India, in Cote d'Ivoire, in South Korea, in Nigeria. And you had the first launch of the vaccination campaigns in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana by the 1st of March, with signaled with the pride of presidents who were getting vaccinated first. Next slide. So where are we today? We have 8.5 billion doses that have already been administered. And of those, 681 have been administered through the COVAX. And we have AVAT and other distribution mechanisms that are laid on top of that to be able to reach this. 2 countries have not yet started, But you have a stark color in the center here in the African region and some fragile countries in other places around the world as well, of persons vaccinated with at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine per 100 population. Africa lagging behind. And this is where we have to also concentrate and be able to support, deliver, have all our efforts, both in secured supply and effective delivery in the countries that are not as fortunate as the dark green pieces here with high immunization rates. Next slide. So where are we on the, if you go to the next slide, please. On the delivery so far, extraordinarily, 56% of the total world population have gotten at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccines. Sounds good, but it's not good enough, right? Because the distribution is still not what we want to see. The highest risk groups in every region, every continent, and every country, and every part of every country, we want to see that shift to a much more equal distribution and delivery. Africa leaning behind with only 6% fully vaccinated. If you say the AU, that's 8%, and then Wipro lying ahead with 71%. And so here you have the fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated, and the non-vaccinated. And those are the ones, of course, we need all to focus on next year. Next slide. And going back to COVAX, there was a very kind of slow start. We wanted to go progressive from January all the way to the end of the year, reaching about 800 to billion doses shipped by COVAX by the end of the year. And it was very challenging the first 6 months, you can say. And then the increase has been substantial in the last couple of weeks and months, actually. So 681 million doses been delivered, and only 150 million doses in November. And we'll go past that in December as well, with hundreds of millions of doses also on the verge of being shipped to countries. Next slide. But COVAX is not the only suppliers, right? There are many other bilateral donations, the procurements directly by countries, the AVAT mechanism, etc. Here you have a picture of the absorption and the administration of doses across the year from January to October, actually it is now, but with all sorts of vaccines. And you can see the ramp up in the last 4 months here, by month, increasing the number of doses being administered in these AMC countries. So as Kate was saying, the capacity to roll out fast arrives when you have a steady supply. Next slide. There are, however, many challenges, and I know I'm not going to go through them a lot because the panel will go into these much more, but the importance of leadership and effective coordination mechanism, dedicated budgets that are in place for the operating teams, lack of supply visibility, many products, short shelf life, cold chain capacity, data and management, data management issues, and competing priorities. All of this will be discussed also in the panel, so I won't go in very fast on this. Next slide. And with all those competing priorities, there are a few countries that really are struggling, and mainly those that either have complexities in political situation, fragility, or maybe the weak systems from decades of non-investment in systems that are able to deliver fast. So this is a slide which is a bit complex, but you see the percent of doses that have been received that are used. So all in the vertical line, 50%, all the countries on the right have been able to swiftly use those vaccines into administrating and vaccinations. On the left-hand side, and particularly on the blue box, is where you have a very low rate of daily vaccination. So below 0.15%, we know countries can go up to 1% of the population per day. But these countries are actually struggling in really getting this out. And we'll discuss this in the panel again. What can we all do to jump these countries over to the other ones fast in the next year? Next slide. So I think I really like this slide because it really shows the complexity that all countries are dealing with at the moment. And that this is not an introduction of one vaccine, right? It's an introduction of multiple programs at the same time almost. Well, you are reaching the same target population, but the products shift, right? So these are AstraZeneca, J&J, Moderna, and all the different vaccines that are in the portfolio now by country in the AMC. So this kind of Christmas tree of complexity, many different vaccines that require different cold chain, that require different administration, that needs a separate training program. All of this, you all in programs have to deal with simultaneously. And on that short shelf life and not knowing very well in advance which one of these vaccines in which volumes will come, of course, this has been really challenging, as you said on the word cloud. Next slide. Just looking in hindsight of COVAX and partners and what countries particularly have managed to do, many of them, you very fast did the NDVP, the planning, also the readiness checklist, trying to start already months and months before the vaccines, actually even before we knew they were going to deliver, right? But now we have 11 vaccines and many different technologies. There are many different innovative mechanisms, including the compensation, no-fault compensation mechanism and the humanitarian buffer that has been really tried to help support the delivery and make people feel safe and accepting these vaccines. ECHO, who's hosting us today, have helped us not only with 30, it's actually up to 42 ECHO sessions with thousands and thousands of participants from different countries around the world discussing what is working, what is not working, and disseminating some of the guidance that has been produced, like this delivery toolkit, etc. But we're looking ahead and working hard also on the side of the supply, increasing supply and know-how in the manufacturing task force. Next slide. So now I want to go into country spotlights. And next slide, I've picked a few slides from distinguished colleagues in country offices like Dr. Vinod Bura, who's here today, because I love these slides. This really shows the complexity and the extraordinary work of immunization programs over the year. These, maybe Vinod, I don't know if you can connect, and if you could, there are 2-3 slides which comes from you and from Nepal. Are you on and can take the floor just 1 minute and go through these 3 slides? Vinod?
Yes, thanks, Anne. And once again, good afternoon, colleagues everywhere. Just wanted to highlight to these slides the commitment of government of Nepal. Within 3 days of receipt of vaccines, they launched the campaign, and the operational cost for the entire initial phase was met by the government of Nepal, which was again a great demonstration of political leadership and commitment from the country. You can see that we have very difficult and hilly areas and mountainous areas. So once we vaccinated our health workers, the government decided to vaccinate people in the mountainous areas first, because these areas do get cut off in the snow and winter seasons. And again, Nepal took priority to vaccinate refugees and migrants as a key challenge, knowing very well that with limited vaccines, there was always a demand for vaccines for the general public, but government took the bold step, I would say, to vaccinate migrants from other countries, refugees and disabled people. And the result is that now we have crossed almost 20 million doses. Nepal is not seeing any deaths at present. This photo shows that in this mountainous districts, everybody was vaccinated above 18 when we got some supplies of vaccines. So, and we went with our prioritization of vaccinating the elderly first. And I'm happy to report that now Nepal sees no COVID deaths. Hardly 1 or 2 deaths are reported with almost 30% fully vaccinated and 40% one dose coverage in the country. Thank you, everybody. No, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vinod. And I know you've been instrumental both when you were working in Indonesia and now in Nepal as well. So extraordinary efforts and reaching the vulnerable. Here are some other photos from you of what has actually happened during this year. Next slide. And with a great thanks to the Minister of Health in South Sudan, I wanted also to highlight some of the jumpstart in the use of electronic devices to actually drive action. Data collection that was set up with quite in very fast way from the health facility, including this in the ODK server, which was it's an online open possibility of sharing data and then having that nationally into Power IB. Next slide. This is how they systematically, day by day, drove the actions and could look at this dashboard from Power BI about the delivered doses, how they reached, looking at the different districts, where are we lacking, where do we need to get the supply to, et cetera, et cetera. So I was deeply impressed by South Sudan as well of getting the system very quickly up. It's a simple one, but it worked. And it was with pride I could hear South Sudan and the country office and the Ministry of Health explaining this in one of the other seminars that we had. Next slide. And so finally, just where we need to go for the next year, where we are at the moment. Next slide. And I'm soon closing. So where are we? We know that WHO set a target for 40% in all countries by the end of 2021. Where are we? Well, we're not there yet. Many of the AMC participants have reached far, very far, even goals met in 16 countries and on track for others. But actually 55 are still not on track, off track. They've not even received from COVAX or any other supply, actually, enough supplies to be able to deliver by the end of the year 40%. We hope that will shift very quickly. As we said, surge in supplies coming up. There are 15 countries also lagging behind. They have sufficient supply, but they need to increase the absorptive capacity. Next slide. And if we look at a map, this is how much the countries need to scale up to be able to reach the targets of 40% by the end of the year. Meaning the dark red here is 10 times more doses delivered every day to be able to reach this. And this was the 8th of December. And so we know where we'll not reach the 40%. Now we're going forward into the other ambitious goal of 70% by mid-year 2022. Next slide. So what do we need to do then? We enter 2022. We need to strengthen our collaboration, all of us together in immunization worldwide, right? To optimize the protection offered by all of these COVID-19 vaccines, taking into account what the Omicron will also do and shift how we use the valuable instruments we have of the COVID-19 vaccines. We are transitioning from a supply constrained model and to an absorption and maybe a demand constrained model. And so what we need to all focus on is supporting that demand-driven, predictable, sufficient supply so that countries actually can implement their targets. And then coordinate and simplify any support countries request, funding, TA. We need to do that swiftly in more of an emergency mode and be able to hear what are the needs and respond super quickly to the needs if there are any requested by the countries. We also need to be mindful of the essential health services and regular immunization services, and then think ahead of how will we strengthen primary healthcare, global health security and surveillance so that we can actually be better prepared for next time. So I think I'll leave the next slide up. Next slide is my last one. We are hoping that everyone will step up in an aligned and coordinated action to achieve the COVID-19 vaccine targets of 70% by the end of June 2022. And this will take all stakeholders, all immunization programs, but also multilateral banks, manufacturers, civil society, all of us to play our different roles in being able to do miracles in the next 6 months. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm very happy to take any questions if that time allows. Over to you, Angela.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a really robust queue of questions in the Q&A box. Why don't I suggest that folks put their questions in, and our panelists are also responding to them as we see them. So why don't we shift slides to the panelists and have the panelists turn on their cameras. I'm really pleased. Next slide, please. We have a video. So apologies for that. Anne, do you still want to cue the video? We're running around 4 minutes late, or we can shift things if you'd like. Yes.
I think yes.
It's very
short.
It would be not an exaggeration to say that this is a pivotal intervention for the whole world to enable countries with varying degrees of ability to access vaccines to be able to protect their citizens. And this is how it ought to have been, and we're very happy that actually this is how it has actually happened. We are currently able to vaccinate about 1 million people a day on the average.
Na ile magonjwa kabambi mwaya ya kuivaincre inaka tu kupitia vaccin. Alors ile kanipousse nikie nijifere vacciner. Kwanza niko expose mkazi yangu. Sona kazi ya taxi tunabebaka huyu ule. Niko expose. Alors kama nakuwa expose nini nyeneza nisaidia? Kwanza ni vaccin. Ya pili na kwa sasa kurespekte ile mesure barrières zenye zilikuwa naziko.
We've seen a drop in cases of COVID-19, but also we've also seen a drop in the number of severe cases that have been admitted in hospitals. So yes, I could attribute this to the vaccination exercise. I have hope that COVID will surely come to an end if we are able to vaccinate every eligible Ugandan. I want to believe we will be able to fight this COVID-19 disease. Thanks so much for playing that, and thanks, Anne, for sharing that with the group. Why don't we shift to the panel that we've been waiting for this session. So as the panelists can show their cameras, we're really happy to hear from a range of folks today. We have Danish Ahmed from the WHO India Country Office. We have Gunter Bosseri from the UNICEF Regional Office, and we have Diana Chong Blanc from WHO Headquarters. We put together this panel from the country level, the regional level, and the HQ level to give kind of a smattering of perspectives from these highly experienced and dedicated staff. And as you have questions for them, please put them in the Q&A box. What we thought we'd do is we thought we'd warm up with a few questions that we've come up with to get folks started. So thanks, Dinesh, Gunter, and Diana for joining. Why don't I start off with the first question as folks put in their queries into the box. We've heard a lot from our previous speakers from a global perspective in terms of experiences, challenges, and milestones. Maybe I can shift toward Dinesh at the country level. As India's administered more than 1.3 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines, could you share with us some of the success factors contributing to this, and perhaps some challenges as well, should you wish? Dinesh?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. As we are aware that India has already administered more than 1.3 billion doses. We started program way back in January, and it's less than a year. So definitely when we look back at the last 11 months of COVID-19 vaccination, of course, India's capacity to produce vaccine, and which was leveraged to produce the COVID-19 vaccines, which remains the backbone and a key success factors. However, in terms of implementation of program, very robust political commitment and the government accountability mechanisms. There was a regular review by the Honorable Prime Minister himself very regularly for this vaccination that has contributed. In addition, we have constituted the special groups or bodies, first in the form of NAGVAC, the National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration, which was a sort of responsible for the facilitating all the decisions with regarding to the vaccine introduction in India. So it includes the Planning Commission, Ministry of Health, and convergence from different line ministries, which were important. So all the decisions were fast-tracked with the constitution of NAGVAC. Additionally, when it comes to implementation, considering the structure India has, the state and district structures. So there were task force which were constituted at state and district level, which includes the highest administrative levels, and they were responsible to ensure the swift implementation of this program. Then there was evidence-based decision-making, which includes like prioritization. We started of beneficiaries. We started with healthcare workers, later moved to frontline workers, then comorbid patients, then elderly with more than 45 years, and then expanding to more than 18 years of the population. We expanded the dose interval to ensure that more and more people get at least one dose of vaccines. The private sector engagement was also ensured, and the vaccines were delivered through private sector as well. And when we are coming towards the fag end, and now most of our population has received at least one dose of vaccine, we are including the house-to-house searches for mobilization and vaccination to ensure that our last beneficiaries get vaccines. In addition, India always traditionally remained a country with rich in polio network, and leveraging the polio network and the lessons that we have learned from the polio eradication program was very helpful in reaching us with this COVID vaccination coverage. We have around 3,000 staff with WHO and close to 1,000 staff with UNICEF. They were leveraged in this vaccine introduction, and they were helping in the capacity building, micro planning, preparedness assessments, dry run, and concurrent monitoring. We were able to orient in a very small time frame of 2 weeks, more than 1.5 million healthcare workers and mobilizers because of this robust infrastructure of polio that we had in India. Similarly, we started with the concurrent monitoring, which helped us to identify gaps, and we are able to monitor more than 1 million sessions as we speak today. Another success factor was the CoWIN platform, which helped us to register beneficiary in an electronic form, helped us in the session planning, vaccine management, reporting the vaccination, and tracking for subsequent doses. We were traditionally weak in tracking, and this used to be the manual, the tracking mechanism. However, in this COVID vaccine introduction, the CoWIN played a very critical role and helped us in tracking for the second dose. So those are some of the success factors that I would like to enumerate. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dinesh. James, I see you have a question. If you could put it in the chat box, that would be great. If not, we'll try to open up in a minute. Why don't we shift a question to the regional level? Gunther, in the region that you cover, South Asia, could you share some innovations or best practices to mobilize community demand for COVID-19 vaccines?
Thank you very much, Angela. Yes, to start off, if we want to mobilize community demand, we first of all need to make sure that we understand and monitor what is living in communities, and to know what their perceptions, their concerns, their drivers, and the social insights of demand are. So to do this, we set up a few mechanisms, and some new ones are the community rapid assessments that are organized by the regional office in collaboration with 4 countries or 5 countries. And it's a kind of a systematic monitoring of what is living in the community. So the protective behaviors are being gauged, the perceptions, the vaccine uptake, the hesitance, all these kind of questions are at regular intervals being monitored, so that you can also see an evolution of this. Another way of collecting information, which was basically existing, but which has been adapted also now for COVID-19, is the use of U-Report. And this is kind of more of needs-based monitoring of what is living in the community, and then mainly for the youth and the adolescents, so that we know their perceptions on COVID-19 vaccines. This is happening in most of the countries of our region, and most of the time there are polls that are being sent out to those young people, to which they respond, and then the answers are compiled, and then we know what is how the situation is. So, but it's also possible with this U-Report to have a bit more in-depth interaction with some dedicated people to get a deeper understanding of what is living. Another kind of new approach to know and understand what is living in communities is the whole social listening exercises that have been or activities that have been set up, whereby social media like Facebook and Twitter are being scanned to create insights, reports on the situation and what is living among the community. So this was something that was previously not existing, and which provides us a huge a wealth of information on what we can do to make sure that we can increase the demand generation. So basically all these monitoring exercises is not for the purpose of monitoring, but basically to improve the decision making and increase action. Another way of increasing demand is kind of engaging with different kind of actors. For instance, recently we organized at the regional level a high-level meeting for faith actors. So this also then is used to in country offices or in countries to establish this the knowledge that has been shared with them at the country level. Also, what was important and what was quite useful, for instance, in Bhutan, what was happened is that the UNICEF country office working on demand was well positioned in the government and in the RCCE committee, so which meant that there was also a multi-sectoral consultation and coordination, which was basically very successful also for the vaccination campaign, which was, as we all know, very successful in Bhutan. Then we organized also a series of webinars, which were not there on demand, and it was basically region-wide on different topics that were hosted by the regional office, but with contributions of different specialists in working in different area of demand generation. So that's also quite important to organize this kind of exercise for the whole region. And a concrete example from Sri Lanka is that they did a kind of capacity building of community leaders, whereby 700 local community leaders were trained on protective behavior, and 400 of them were then put on a WhatsApp group, so that there was a continuous interaction between experts and those community leaders on what could be done to improve demand. Then we still have some good examples from good practices that to increase demand. The first one is the door-to-door community engagement, which happened in various countries, that people going from door to door, and not only to increase the engagement, but also in some cases, these door-to-door visits were used to promote actually the vaccination uptake. So for instance, in Bangladesh and India, youth volunteers were helping people that had no access to internet to make sure they could do their online registration for the vaccination. So besides the engagement, community engagement, it also has a practical aspect. Other areas that were important or that are maybe interesting for others to know is that, for instance, also in Bhutan, there was a very structured and transparent approach to media and risk communication. So you had engagement of the Prime Minister, you had very frequent press briefs from the Ministry of Health, you had sharing of the evolution of the status of coverage in the country that was broadcasted every day. So IEC materials were sent in advance to the public or shared with the public, so that people really were very well aware of what was going to happen. So yeah, also in Pakistan, just an example just on how to improve or initiatives were taken to reduce the gender gap in vaccine coverage. So specific messages for pregnant and lactating women, engaging gynecologists that were used in also morning shows to target female audiences, and many more other activities. So really a lot has been happening in the region to make sure that demand was being created, and there was a good uptake for vaccination in the region. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Gunther. I'm going to take a few questions from the Q&A box. And so there's two questions that are somewhat related. Thanks, James, for putting it in the box. Perhaps I'm going to start with Diana and see if others perhaps want to also add. The question is, we're seeing African continent lagging behind. What's the strategic vaccine equity for the continent? And Andrew's question also talks about his concern about less logistics support for distribution at the local levels, funding to roll out vaccination, and low demand creation, given imminent expiry of stock. And so, Diana, could I start with you with these kind of combined questions?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Yeah, I'll try my best. So I think the first, they're both really good questions and interrelated. I think the first is just to remind everybody that based on the data we see, there's about 140 doses per 100 persons in high-income countries that are delivered. In low-income countries, there are 7 doses per 100 persons. That's quite dramatic. And the reason I point that out is in order to advocate for the countries that are falling behind, the data is important. It tells a story at the global level. It shines a light on where the gaps are. So picking back up on Kate's point, really encouraging countries to provide that data, to speak forth and share that data, because that's what we are able then to use to advocate at the global or regional level with different partners to see how stark that contrast is and how disturbing that contrast is. That's one. Second is the recognition, the growing recognition. You know, we haven't had a program like this for those outside of the infant age group. It's unprecedented, you know, other than decades ago with smallpox or even perhaps polio. But I think there's not been a recognition how complex it is. It's not just sending the doses. It is actually the convergence of all these factors. It's the supply logistics of the doses. It's the funds in place where you need them. It's the human resources. It's the public information systems. It's the building of the vaccination sites. It's the coordination of all those activities nationally, which can only happen if there's strong political leadership and drive to make the program a success. And I think this is something that is slowly, again, been an experience that countries are learning as they're doing. And as that happens, also being able to share their national experiences to the outside world so that others understand how complex it is and what's needed. So as Kate said, next year, supply will liberate quite generously, both in terms of the current products we have and in terms of the new products. So in terms of supply logistics, that will enable countries to be actors in the implementation of what they're doing and manage their programs to the level of their own ambition. So that's one piece, but it's just one small piece. It's an essential piece, but it's one small piece in terms of the network of things that need to happen that Gunter and Danish and Vinod already spoke about. So I think in terms of addressing the inequities, I think that it's also important for us to advocate in the different fora at a political level, at a technical level of what the gaps are and what's needed to fill them. And there are efforts on the COVAX side to do exactly that, to try to coordinate different technical donors, CSOs at the local level, financial bilaterals, multilaterals to support countries in the gaps, to address the things that need to happen to enable this scale up. So it's not an easy solution. I don't think there's any one magic bullet. I think it's a complex array of factors. But as we work together as a global community and profile these issues in fora such as this, I think there's an increased understanding from actors outside of domestic situations of what's required, and a real desire to scale that up and scale up that support to support countries so we get to a more equitable picture in 2022. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Diana, and thanks to the participants for the questions. There are a number of questions here that I'm going to flag for our speakers, Gunter, Diana, and Danish, if you can respond to them in the chat box. One around the humanitarian buffer, one around databases, some commentaries. For the questions that we don't get to, then we'll respond to them via email and send them out to the y'all participants. Let me shift to our next speaker. We're really pleased to have Scott Pendergast here, who will be talking about from WHO, the World Health Emergencies Program, who will be talking about shaping the response for an accelerated action in 2022. Scott, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Angela, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. So my name is Scott Pendergast. I work for WHO. I'm in the Emergencies Program, and I'm the Director for Strategy, Planning and Partnerships. And recently becoming much more involved in the downstream delivery of ACT, including the work around vaccines, but not just vaccines, also looking at the rollout and scale up of country delivery for diagnostics and for therapeutics and for PPE and protecting health workers and protecting health systems. So today what I wanted to go through is a few ideas about how we're planning to shape this work, and it would be great to get feedback in terms of ideas of how we can do it better. So if we can just switch to the slides, that'd be great. So the title is really from the Health Systems Connector within ACT to the Health Systems and Response Connector. How do we reinforce our support for countries and aligning with the broader response that's happening? Next slide. So as part of the updated ACT strategy, there was a strategic review, and a number of recommendations came through that review in terms of what we should be better doing at health systems level and country support level. And one of the big things that came out, and you're already seeing it under vaccination, but it's really across all of the different areas within the ACT tools, is we need to move from the sort of upstream kind of discovery, clinical trials, manufacturing, market shaping and procurement, to actually really moving to the downstream delivery of those tools into health systems and into the response. And we need to see a big shift from ACT on that. And I think we've already seen the shift, and I think Kate went through that very well on the vaccine side, in terms of now that we're starting to get the supply, the focus needs to be going onto the country delivery, and really it has to be happening in all the other areas. The second is that the delivery of ACT tools is not happening at country level, is not happening in kind of isolation. It's happening within health systems, which have got other priorities as well. And it's also happening within the national response system. So to some extent, what has to happen is that the ACT vertical pillars, we call them, the product pillars, need to be more deeply connected with national health systems and also the national response systems. And in a way, we need to flip the equation. So rather than seeing country delivery as a means of achieving the ACT targets, we really need to see ACT tools as a means of achieving country targets. And then really that's the area of the health systems and response connector is really going to be focusing on that issue. Next slide, please. So in summary, trying to be more responsive to country needs and access gaps, fully incorporate the national response plans under the Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan, get a much greater focus on near-term response imperatives. Obviously, we're not going to be able to fix the entire health system through this phase, but we have to make sure that we don't do any harm to the health system. And we really need to focus on the effective support to the delivery of the new tools at country level into integrated response and integrated health systems. Certainly, it came through very loud and clear that there's a lot of other groups that need to be and have a lot of capacity and need to be included in the delivery. And so we have to find more effective mechanisms for reaching out with a broader range of implementation partners and civil society organizations. Next slide, please. So in terms of where the health systems and response connector area that I'm talking about sits within the overall ACT value chain, is ACT was initially set up really around trying to discover and make available new tools that could help us with this pandemic response. And so a lot of the work has been, as I said, in sort of research and development, where some amazing work has been done at record speed. Then working with manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, to do scale up and scale out that manufacturing capability to tech transfer so that we've got more companies that are able to produce these products. And then there's been a lot of focus in terms of really using political advocacy, financial fundraising to ensure that we're getting greater equity and access, mainly through procurement, to these new products for all countries where the need is. And now we're really at that last mile in terms of once we get the products available, we really now need to scale up and sync with country demand and delivery. Next slide, please. So the health systems and response connector has been established. It was there last year as part of the health systems connector, but it's been a little bit revitalized. In it, we've got 4 co-leads: the Global Fund, the World Bank, WHO, and UNICEF. And between them, really, they've got a lot of the financial and operational support to be given at country level. We feed into the overall ACT Facilitation Council, and we've also got a reference group of civil society organizations of political leads that we feed into. And then there's really 3 streams of delivery that we've got around scaling up our capacity. So one of them is around country needs, gaps, planning, and financing. And we really need to get this much more holistically done. At the moment, there's a bit of fragmentation, I think, as I see it, in country planning and financing, where you've got some pockets of money around the C19RM, you've got pockets of money around the World Bank, you've got the response pockets of money, but they really need to be brought together. And we're seeing, I think, the same thing in terms of the country planning, which is really, really challenging. And as Kate pointed out, without having a clear understanding of when the delivery of actual supplies and products is going to be, it's difficult to do those scale-up plans. And so we've got to band together, and certainly we're working very closely with the COVAX teams, but also we're going to be working closely with the diagnostics and therapeutics teams of how to get that planning done. There's also a need to get better implementation monitoring. There's a lot of trackers around at the moment, but there's not many that actually bring that information together on a reliable, accurate, accessible level. And so we've actually launched another tool, and I'll try and put it in the chat, called the Global COVID Access Tracker, which is tracking across all the different areas where we are in terms of outcome and delivery, but also where we are in terms of access and country scale up. So they're the 2 things under workstream 1. Under the middle workstream, we're working directly with the different areas under vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, and I'll get back to that in a minute in terms of scaling up delivery. And then under workstream 3, we're really looking at 2 things. One is making sure that the underlying health system, we're able to maintain essential health services, and there's a lot of investments going on in that, but also looking at the sort of transversal platforms that we need to scale up at the national level in terms of scaling up health workforce, in-country logistics and supply chains, community engagement, risk communication, translation of evidence into action in terms of implementation guidelines. So we're focusing on scaling up the work across those areas in support to the delivery of the vertical pillars. And then we're also looking at working around protecting essential health and care workers through better infection prevention and control and PPE and WASH at facility level. So that's really the scope of work with the Health Systems and Response Connector. Next slide, please. In terms of reaching out to the vertical pillars, there's been some work, and this is quite an early slide, but in terms of really understanding what are some of the critical gaps at the moment. So when we discussed with the COVAX pillars, and a lot of these issues have come up, there's specific issues around scaling up surge workforce, so going beyond the EPI platform, and really trying to either scale up national health services or emergency health services to help with the vaccination. In particular, we're going to have issues, and we are having issues in the hard-to-reach populations in the fragile, conflict vulnerable settings where we've got other emergency operations going on. Increasingly, we're looking at scaling up the PPE and infection prevention and control for vaccinators, but also looking at the bio-waste management, which will become an issue, and trying to work out new solutions and new partnerships to deal with that. One of the other big downsides of this, and especially through EPI, overuse of EPI, is the potential impact on routine immunization. And so we're closely monitoring that and looking at the different investments that we need to make there in order that we're able to continue the two activities at the same time. On the diagnostics and therapeutics pillars, I think they're behind actually at the moment where vaccines is in terms of delivery. There have been new tools available. We have been scaling up, for example, oxygen. We have been rolling out antigen rapid diagnostic tests. But really, I think this needs to be brought together more at a scale like COVAX. And one of the, I think, the key areas is going to be around scaling up support to clinical care pathways for COVID. And this would be really from the point of entry into the health system, especially if we potentially get new antivirals coming through where there's some potential, which would be able to do mild case treatment for at-risk groups, as long as we're able to identify and test those and test early. And then we need to go through the clinical care pathway to up to the severe case management, where we're really looking at both oxygen and other types of steroid therapeutics. And so I think one of the key areas we're going to be working on with the other two pillars is really a unified approach to scaling up support to clinical care pathways in a similar way that COVAX has been able to scale up support to rolling out vaccination. Next slide, please. So that's really where we are. There's a lot more information that will be coming out in the coming weeks and months, and I'd be very happy to be able to have another chance to speak as we start delivering. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for being with us, Scott. Do you have a moment for questions?
Sure.
Okay, let's take a look-see. We've had a robust conversation this morning, 21 questions answered. We have none live. So if folks have questions for Scott around these actions and this acceleration for 2022, please put them in the chat box. Let me scroll over to see if we have any folks raising their hands or otherwise. Okay, it looks like you've done such a thorough job. We have no questions for now. If folks think of questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get those answered. Thanks for your time, Scott. We're going to shift to kind of a closing. Let me double check to see if Mike Ryan is here.
Angela, there's one hand up from Jane.
Good.
One hand up from Jane.
Jane.
It doesn't show on my, yes, here it is. All these little bits and pieces to take a look at. So Jane, I don't know if we can unmute you to be able to ask, or if you want to put your question in the chat box. Echo India, is it possible to unmute the hand? I can see the hand, but I can't see who it's from.
Angela, I can also see we've got Mike online, so maybe we can go to Mike and then come back to any questions.
Okay, great. It looks like we have two queries now. So why don't we shift to Mike for some closing thoughts? Attendees will work on unmuting you, but in the meanwhile, if you wouldn't mind putting your query in the Q&A box, should you wish to ask it live, we'll work on that technically as well. Mike, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Angela. And my words won't be too many. It's really just as we come to the end of the year to thank everybody for the superhuman efforts that everyone has made. I think it's just about a year since COVID-19 vaccines were administered. 8.5 billion people vaccinated around the world. And this group of partners has done everything possible, pulled out all the stops to try and create an allocation and distribution and vaccination platforms that would bring some degree of equity to this whole process. Sadly, that hasn't been fully achieved. That is not down to the efforts of the partners, but more to the externalities and some of the deep issues we have on this planet with recognizing equity and solidarity, and also, frankly, recognizing epidemiologic principles of the best use of vaccines and those who need it most. But that shouldn't in any way cloud people's sense of pride and their sense of satisfaction with what you have all come together to do. But that doesn't mean the job is done. We still have a huge gap in vaccines, particularly in low-income countries. We have huge gaps in vaccine within countries. We talk about inter-country equity, but there are huge issues with intra-country equity. And as we face now through Delta and Omicron variants emergence, what we're actually seeing is the more transmissible viruses reaching those vulnerable, under-vaccinated or unvaccinated populations. And that's really what's driving the massive increases in hospitalizations that we've seen across even the most developed countries. So the reality is it's not who we've been vaccinating, it's who we've been missing. And I say we as a collective, we, governments, the international community. And we need to redouble our efforts, not only to push vaccination across all countries, particularly for those who are most vulnerable. And we really have to recommit ourselves to ensuring that vulnerable and at-risk people everywhere, the marginalized everywhere, have access to a primary course of vaccine for life protection. We will also have to deal in the coming months with the duality of booster doses or extension of primary doses. And there's going to have to be a strong conversation around priorities. Priorities shift and change depending on epidemiologic situations and the tools you have available. You always have to be prepared to go back and look at both and make a reassessed decision. Are we using the vaccines that we have at our disposal in the most effective way, both in terms of their ability to reduce suffering and death, and with equity and with the same treatment for everybody being at the core of that discussion. There are emerging issues, certainly in a number of countries on the delivery side. Some countries are struggling with some of the aspects of vaccination and vaccination programs. Some countries, many countries, in fact, North and South, are struggling with vaccine hesitancy. So it isn't the vaccines that are going to do the job, it's vaccination. And there are real issues with community trust. There are real issues with how vaccine programs have been constructed in some countries. There are inherent inequities in the way some vaccination programs have been designed and implemented themselves. We need to make sure that vaccination programs themselves don't enhance inequity, but reduce inequity and get to those who can most benefit from these sessions or from these vaccines. Again, we haven't reached the 40% target for the end of the year. There's a sub-question to that. How well are we doing at reaching the most vulnerable in all countries? And that's a question that I think we need to look at very carefully. 40% of the population of every country aren't highly vulnerable. There is a subunit of that, of people with underlying conditions, older persons, people with immunologic compromise, high-risk frontline workers. There are people who need absolutely to be covered as we face now into a potentially fourth wave of transmission generated by Omicron. So we need to redouble our efforts. Certainly, industry need to be I've said it before, our partners, not our masters. We need a really strong partnership to ensure that vaccine supplies are not only signed off on, but that there's, I think one of the things, and I don't know, Anne, you may have spoken to this earlier, part of the reason for wastage of vaccines in some countries is short shelf life. It's not knowing when the vaccine is coming. It's not being able to micro-plan appropriately. It's almost like someone says ready, steady, and then doesn't say go, and you're waiting for go. And by the time go comes, you've lost that energy. You've lost that sense of being springed and coiled and ready to act. So there are a huge number, and I found this myself in polio, working with polio for a number of years. It's not one thing that makes a vaccination program successful. It's everything. And if you want to operate any system at a high level of performance, you've got to look at every element from A to Z, where you can eke out 5% more here, 2% more there, 1% more on the other place. And I think it is, you know, at the end of the year, time to reflect. Are we doing everything in all the right places? Where are the wins for the early next year? Where can we accelerate our efforts most effectively? And most importantly, keeping this concept of equity at the center of everything we do. People have been incredible. It's been an incredible victory for science. It's been an incredible victory for vaccination in so many ways. And yet there are obstacles to success that are generated externally to the work that everyone here is doing. But that's life. The reality is, in all the things we want to do, there are always barriers. And some of those barriers, the most important thing in any program is not to be jumping barriers that you've erected yourself. You know, that you make sure that you're not making the barriers, make sure that you're not responsible for the problems that maybe coming back to haunt you. And I do think as we move into next year, we really have to look at the issues of hesitancy. Hesitancy around the world is growing. It's growing for any number of reasons, but we need to make absolutely sure, and congratulations for the acceleration of vaccine provision through COVAX has been remarkable over the last number of weeks. Absolutely incredible to see that acceleration. But as that vaccine availability accelerates, we'll now face the realities of logistics, of vaccination program effectiveness and efficiency, of vaccine hesitancy. They're the headwinds ahead. They're there, they're real, and they need to be managed proactively by everybody if this is to be ultimately a successful program. This collaboration on COVID vaccines has saved so many lives. You all have saved so many lives by your efforts, but the job is not yet done. So it's just really a note of thank you to you all for your perseverance, for your courage, for your solidarity, and for your unwavering commitment to serving the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike, for being here and carving out time as well as addressing our colleagues. Why don't we try to squeeze one question in from Jamie, if we can unmute her before we end with our closing slides. Jamie, are you on? You have a question that I don't see in the Q&A. You're still on mute. I don't know if we can unmute the person who has their hand up. Okay. If you could put your question in the chat, in the Q&A box. We have, I think, one more question that we'll try to answer, that we will answer via email. We want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. We have 1 minute, and why don't we put up the slide on kind of the webinar materials and the continuing education units. As we get that slide up, I want to give a sincere thanks, as always, to our translators who do an amazing job trying to make sure that they catch every bit and piece that we're saying, perhaps not as slowly as we should. Next slide, please. As with every ECHO session,
you'll be able to find all the webinar materials. That includes the recordings as well as slides. They're always, for this series as well as the previous 2 series, posted on the TechNet website as well. If you have questions and want to share your experience, you have the TechNet site as well as the Telegram site in English, French, and Spanish. Next slide. I think that the last slide that we have is this one, which is thank you to everyone, echoing what Kate and Mike, Scott, and all have said. All questions that we have not responded to and not answered will be shared with our technical experts, answered and shared via email. Have a fabulous rest of your day, evening, night. Have a wonderful holiday season, get some rest, and look forward to 2022. Thank you all.
Thank you all.